I had thought paperwork was, at its most dramatic, a paper cut and a faint, stinging sense of responsibility. I had filed my life into neat categories: homework, rent, the one-time apology to a neighbor for mowing their lawn at dawn, and I believed that a properly folded form solved more problems than it created. Then I misfiled Form 42B, and the mayor's hat became crustaceanly, and I learned the Bureau's truest secret. Our world was less a machine than a negotiation. Chapter 7 began like many ordinary mornings inside the building, the smell of toner and distant thunder, the hum of fluorescent light like an anesthetized cloud. But ordinary is a flexible word at the Bureau. We were already on edge. Tuesday had tried to borrow last Thursday's afternoons. The clocks had been flirting with opposites. And the mayor's lobster had become a national emblem for all the wrong reasons. By the time I arrived at the meeting room, the air had the static of a public relations disaster and the focused panic of an insurance claim. The meeting room was more ledger than carpet. Long table, chairs with polite but inflexible posture, a whiteboard on which someone had lovingly drawn a pie chart labeled anomalies by affection. People sat in their campings like tiny islands of conviction. The automation proponents had set up a small demonstration unit on a rolling cart, a chrome box with a friendly nameplate, Auto Remediate, Model 2-1. It blinked cheerfully. It promised clean lines and zero sentiment. "Imagine," said one of the automation advocates, smoothing a presentation into place, "a world where anomalous occurrences are stamped away with mathematical precision. No lobster hats, no misordered weekdays, no public confusion. Continuity restored in 3 business cycles, or your time back guaranteed." "What a comforting lie," muttered Owen under his breath, which in his case was an almost audible gesture of dissent. He had the air of someone who'd once been a practical joker at summer camp, and then went on to become a bureaucrat because the form needed signing. He kept a smudge of ink like a badge behind his ear and a habit of stapling ideas together literally and figuratively. Mies. Ledger, as austere as a postal code and as watchful as a stamp collector at an auction, did not clap at presentations. She sat at the head of the table, like someone who had once logged an entire town's snowfall into a single, scientifically accurate ledger and refused to let it be anonymized. Her hands ink-stained and sure kept their own rhythm, as if counting paper clips would steady the room. "Automation is not a policy," she said coolly. "It is a taxidermy machine for mistakes. Instead of negotiating with novelty, it says, 'I had thought,' in the quiet hours between kettle whistles and the soft sigh of the copy room, that a stapler was a stapler. Simple, useful, a small metal mouth that clenched things together so they would stop escaping. I had been wrong. By the time we gathered for the first stapling, the stapler felt, to me, like a priest, or perhaps a locksmith, or an animal with a very small, very officious appetite. Owen set them out like a line of old friends. He arranged the tray of staplers on the conference table with the concentration of someone arranging instruments before a concert. There were regular office staplers, a heavy industrial one that looked like it had eaten reports for breakfast. A novelty stapler shaped like a tiny rhinoceros that someone had slipped in for luck, and in the center, like a reliquary, a straight brass thing that clicked with the satisfaction of a ritual object. He smoothed his hands over them and winked at me, as if I should understand that nothing in our line of work was ever merely functional. "They like an audience," he said. "They like purpose, and they particularly like being asked politely." I had dressed for competence, the blazer 2 sizes too large. As always, but the blazer felt less like armor and more like a banner I had yet to learn how to carry. Mies Ledger stood near the tea urn, watching the table as if it were a battlefield and the staplers were unexpectedly rankable troops. Even her crease of worry seemed to stiffen, taking orders. Registrar Amy moved between us with a stack of forms that smelled faintly of citrus and old paper, which is how I learned there are bureaucratic smells and that each office keeps its own olfactory archive. "We will not be dramatic," Mies Ledger said. though it was obvious she had learned to love a little drama, the way people love rare spices. We will be precise. We will follow precedent. Precedent here is a kind of liturgy. At the bureau, precedent is the melody everyone hums when the thunder outside wants to improvise. I mouthed the word and felt the syllables like a rehearsal. Owen was already murmuring the litany he had written on the back of an index card, the words a cross between a memo and a lullaby. He had a talent for turning policy into cadence. Dot arrived as dots always do, fluttering in on the margins, leaving a trail of coffee smudge like a child dragging a bookmark through a puddle. It smelled of pastry and printer ink. I had bribed it with a custard tart the size of a postage stamp, and for reasons of motive and appetite it had agreed to be bait. Dot sat on my palm and trembled in a way that suggested it had been fed both sugar and belief. Ellipses, it whispered. Or perhaps it was more like a thought that smelled like ellipses. It reached to the pastry and nibbled, leaving a constellation of crumbs that, on the table's surface, looked suspiciously like marginalia. "Be careful," Mies' ledger said. Her voice was the sound of a ledger snapping closed just in time. Dot eats margins. It is useful and it is dangerous. We had spent the morning drafting the ritual, signatures nested within signatures, a loop of postage stamps folded in half to act as a talisman, a clause written in such a way that it read simultaneously as permission and apology. Registrar Amy inked a line with an emergency purple stamp that smelled like violet and old commitments. "Processing," she said, which in her mouth meant both done and prepared to be undone, depending on the recipient. Owen's plan was, in essence, to make the slip believe it had found a mistake worth settling into. Creatures of misalignment, like all opinionated pests, are one with the scent of confirmation. We would staple a cluster of contradictions together in a way that made them look intentional. We would feed Dot a marginal note written in a honeyed hand. We would file the resultant bundle into the crevasse of a filing cabinet that was, according to the registry, unoccupied, though the registry only ever told the truth by the percentage the lights in Harmon's vault gave it that day. For my part, my responsibility was small and terrible: hold the brass stapler and make the first strike. I had imagined dramatic things. I had imagined a blinding light and perhaps a chorus of torn paper singing. I had not imagined the sound the stapler made when the brass teeth met pages that had been breathed upon with intention. It was less a clap than a settling. If the world were a dress, the staple was a pin. If the world were a heart, it was a stitch. We began. Owen murmured the words of the litany lines about signatures as seals and paper as skin, and the others ritually tapped their stamps to the table. The ritual, in practice, was bureaucratic theater. It had the pomp of solemnity, the silliness of old office law, and the focused hope of a half-mumbled prayer. I pressed the stapler down, and the brass sealed the forms that had been folded to look like invitations. At first, it worked. The Cluster 2 incident reports, a petition, and a string of post-it apologies held together like a small island. Dot, licking custard from its paper like fingers, circulated a marginal note I had written hastily about the right to minor improvisation under extenuating circumstances. It glowed faintly and I felt, absurdly, like a person who had successfully parallel parked an abstract concept. Then the slip noticed. If you have never felt watched by something that is mostly absence, you have never met a slip at attention. It does not appear with great drama. Instead, it unfurls a question mark in the air like smoke. The room's light wavered. Then, as if someone withheld a sigh, the slip sent a small, disgruntled vibration through the hallways in a motion, like a comma that had been allowed to become a period. Dot twitched. It had been feeding on the marginal note, crunching annotations the way some people chew on pencil ends. It paused and turned its head, which was mostly edges and the scent of coffee. A smear of ink lifted from the table, and in that smear the shape of a smudge took a more definite form, a soot-colored smear with eyes like mismatched stamps. It seemed almost embarrassed to be noticed, the way a cat might be embarrassed to be caught in a hat. It hummed. If the slip had a tune, it would be the thing libraries make when they rearrange themselves at night. It was a thrumming, like an old mimeograph whir. "Now," Owen said, and the word was both a command and a shield. We drove the brass staple in. The metal closed on paper and on possibility. For a bearable instant it seemed that the paperwork had held like a bridge that supports weight for a heartbeat. The stapling was partial salvation. A little seam of sequence retook its place. I felt like someone who had stitched a small, stubborn seam back into the world's hem. And then a retired copy of Mies Ledger stepped out of an alcove and began to file a counter-offer. She looked like Mies Ledger, but not. She wore an older suit, pressed with the conviction of decades, and there was a softness in the lines of her face that the current Mies Ledger had learned to hide. She carried a leather-bound folio and a fountain pen with a nib that suspected protests. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had been mid-retirement and had decided to return because a file had insulted her sense of propriety. "This appears to be a regular procedure," the retired copy said. Her voice was Mies Ledger's but flavored like an archived recording. "I must insist on a formal response." Everything in the conference room, for a suspended administrative second, went credulous. Papers shifted like a flock of fidgety birds. Even Harmon's distant calendar flipped a page, as if to check the date. "We invited the retired copy," Owen said quickly, charming. "She serves as witness." Mies Ledger, current Mies Ledger, did not look persuaded. She pinched a paperclip until it worried its own edges. "We do not invite our past selves unannounced," she said. "We learn from them, not rehire them." But the retired Mies Ledger had already started to stamp. She stamped in a slow, ceremonial rhythm, and the stamps were not wholly benign. They made the forms murmur. Salutations on a nearby stack of letters rose and rearranged themselves like birds turning mid-flight. The first letter, I noticed, redrafted its opening from "Dear Sir" or "Madam" to something less formal, something warmer, "To the evening that called me." Letters do not generally change their own minds. They are, by definition, repositories. But when stamps and staplers play priest and locksmith together, letters sometimes rethink their salutations. The room hummed with the rearranging of intentions. Some salutations turned to jokes. One became a haiku. A formal request for a variance redressed itself to whom this may concern, who might be kindly. The slip of paper, I had been appointed to hold one of the petition forms, stirred under the staple and pushed out a tiny foot of ink like a tongue. It wriggled. Dot, distracted by a more savory margin on an adjacent form, lunged. In the snap of Dot's movement, the pastry spilled more crumbs, and a smear of ink caught the crumbs and turned them into a map. The map showed us a narrow back route through the stacks, a ladder of envelopes with the note, "If you must chase, do it quietly." The ritual had begun to do what rituals do when you do them badly and with love. It opened doors. The slip did not so much fight as respond with the same language we had used, punctuation for punctuation. It sent us a counter-charm, the retired Mies Ledger filed a counter-offer that, on first glance, was an accusation. On second glance, it was an olive branch arranged with margins. "It wants negotiation," Owen breathed. He had a conspiracy in his eyes that made him look like an architect of improbable memos. "It wants to be recognized." Recognition is a dangerous thing to offer a creature born of shredded amendments. Recognition gives it categories. Categories give it a place to sit and rewrite its salutations. But what else, in good faith, could you do when faced with something that seemed to insist you remember the difference between a mistake and a mercy? The repercussions were not immediate and grand. The universe did not fall open in a cathedral of falling forms. Instead, it shifted around the edges like a person who has been offered a proper chair and decides to sit, rearranging the curtains and the light. Several memos in the in-tray labeled "for immediate attention" redressed themselves to "for possible consideration." If you are not a monster, and one requisition for a paper shredder was rewritten into a request for a community ledger. People on our floor found themselves smiling at unexpected times. But there were costs. A clerk on the third floor discovered an afternoon she had planned for Tuesday had vanished until she found a purple inked slip buried in a coat pocket that read, "You will have Tuesday next Thursday. Please do not overbook Thursdays." She cried with the odd combination of gratitude and frustration one does when someone refuses to give you Tuesday but insists on giving you something kinder in its place. A street corner that had been scheduled to receive a pothole repair in the morning received a rain that afternoon instead. A rain that smelled like rosemary and made the pigeons gallop differently. And the slip, which had been teased into presence by the pastry and the stapling and our attempt at ritual, thrummed with something like curiosity. It had wanted misalignment, yes, but not anarchy. It wanted conversation. Archaeological creatures, even those born in the detritus of mistake, often prefer to be appreciated for their artistry. Mies. Ledger, who had been stern through much, softened in a way that surprised me. The crease in her face loosened. "We must adjudicate the counter-offer," she said. "We will allow one concession in exchange for the resealing of the cluster. We offer a curated error. A curated error is, by Bureau standards, a mercy. It is a deliberate imperfection, a small kindness built into the system. We had proposed such things in lectures but never signed one off." Harmon, who had not been present at the stapling, but whose vault key hummed with approval through the building, sent a note via Registrar Amy. "Consideration granted in principle. Proceed with caution and pastry." There was laughter in the room, a soft, guilty sound. We had sewed a seam and invited a guest into our own bedrooms. The slip retreated into the margins with the careful air of someone who has been given both acknowledgement and a place to leave their hat. It left crumbs, ink crumbs, a punctuation like a confetti of commas, and a ledger notation that simply read, "Agreed, provisionally." I felt both triumphant and chastened. We had not captured the slip in iron and ledger. We had instead negotiated with it. We had offered a stapled promise and been given, in return, the knowledge that some mistakes were not to be erased but curated. I learned, standing there in the residue of pastry and ink, that paper can be both armor and altar, when the retired Mies. Ledger signed her counteroffer, something about the current Mies. Ledger's shoulders relaxed. She tucked the counteroffer into a drawer marked "might be" and inked a small note in the margin in her own cramped hand. "Do not let tidy disappear. Let it be mischievous." We filed the stapled bundle into the unoccupied cabinet, though unoccupied in bureau terms means free enough to allow for negotiation, and curled up in a corner of the tray. Its body a scrap of annotated parchment, as content as any creature that has eaten the right pastry. The office smelled of burnt sugar, ink, and a light, distant thunder. There was the feeling, for the first time in days, that the worst of the slipping might be contained without the sacrifice of small mercies. Yet when I left the room and the normal corridor sounds returned, the soft shuffle of shoes, the distant click of a teaspoon against china I heard, threaded through the ordinary noises a new sound. It was the staccato of post-salutations rearranging themselves in a new order, a chorus of letters insisting on a less formal address to the world. It was, in a way I could not wholly explain, a better music. The first stapling had not been perfect. It had left us with living revisions and a retired supervisor with opinions. It had shown us that the barest procedures could be bent ceremonially, but not broken. Rules, I learned, are not rigid bones, they are scaffolds. You can lean on them and occasionally hang a small painting from them. But if you tried to treat them like braces that would forever straighten the world, you would be disappointed. As for the slip, it had gone back to nibbling the margins. It had left us a marginal note that said, in an ink that shimmered when you weren't looking directly at it, "Thank you. Keep one lobster." That last line made me laugh despite myself. It was ridiculous, a creature of contrast asking for a lobster. but absurdity has weight when you need it. It tipped the balance away from panic and toward a mode of being that allowed small wonder. We had a victory and a reminder. The victory, a cluster of contradictions, was now held in place, provisionally. The reminder, when you bargain with the margins, you must be prepared for the margins to reply. They will not always be polite. They will sometimes file counter-offers. They will sometimes write salutations that are kinder than your heart allows. The office crawled back toward its normal rhythms. Registrar Amy stacked the now stapled bundle with an affectionate, almost maternal pat. Ms. Ledger replaced her tea with a different cup, one with a chipped rim that had lodged a small charm inside, and she said softly, to no one in particular, "We will keep the lobster." There was a tenderness in the sentence that made my chest feel like the flat of a newly copied page. I walked back to my desk feeling both heavier and lighter. The brass stapler sat in the tray like a small altar. I touched its edge and felt the haptic memory of the strike, the pressure, the exact resistant give of paper willing to be bound. There was an odd comfort in the knowledge that the world, under certain conditions, could be resewn. There was, too, a deeper discomfort in knowing the seam would sometimes hold small, deliberate imperfections. That night I hummed one of the bureau's quieter jingles and filed a sticky note under maybe. On it I wrote, in a shaky hand, "Keep some mistakes. They make better stories." And for reasons I could not then name, which would make perfect sense later, I added beneath it, also, "Buy more pastry for Dot." I have always believed that paper remembers things we cannot. That was the first lie the bureau taught me, and also its best consolation. On the morning the fingerprints of days started to smudge, I had clung to the idea that if I could simply stamp hard enough, sequence would obey. By chapter 9, which turned out to be a long, spooled ribbon of paper and confession, I was learning that stamps had feelings and signatures could be coaxed into sympathy. We followed the paper like a faint, apologetic scent. It started as marginalia, a tilt of a dash here, and ellipses nibbled at the corner of a report, ink dragged like a small animal fleeing a hand. That was the sort of thing Dot liked to leave behind, little punctuation crumbs that told stories. But this trail was heavier. Someone had written in the margins in a hurried, almost human scrawl. And the scrawl led down corridors where the fluorescent lights hummed like old generators and the air smelled of glue, toner, and yesterday's tea. Owen walked with his hands in his coat pockets and an index card behind his ear, which made him look exactly like a man trying to outrun a punchline. He didn't walk ahead so much as drift, like someone who had learned to conserve his kinetic guilt. We were a motley flock, Mies. Ledger at my left, regally bent over a map of stamped departments she had folded into a shape that fit in her palm. Registrar Amy at my right, carrying a small stack of requisitions with the steady grace of someone who knows exactly where to put a delayed prayer. I borrowed my breath from them. There is an odd bravery in following paperwork into a basement. You tell yourself that basements are for lost things and for bones, and if anything is going to be awkwardly preserved, it's going to be something that snarls at tidy schedules. Yet when we passed a door labeled Amendment Archive Authorized Only, the word authorized seemed to shiver. Authorized against whom? Against the slip? Against whoever had once allowed a redaction machine to nap in the dark? I didn't ask. I didn't have to, Mies. Ledger's fingers were already counting paper clips, and I knew that when she counted it was a competence charm. We found Owen in the stacks where the light was polite and distant. He had his back to a shelf and his shoulders leaned against a spine of boxes. There was a small, shameful softness to his posture, the kind possessed by people who have kept something under their pillow because it prevents nightmares. He turned when he heard us and smiled like someone who had just told a joke to his own memory. "You look better from the side," I said, "because we do whatever small duties let us pretend we are in control." "Don't I always?" he replied, voice like a tired magnet. Then he let go, and he let go in the way people do when they've been carrying a paperweight for longer than is professionally recommended. He thumbed open a creased folder, as careful as a Butterfingers priest, and from it we saw well, not the file itself, but the aura of it. People hoard small things for many reasons: sentiment, fear, habit. Owen hoarded a file because it belonged to a day in which something impossible had been kind. "It's nothing administrative," he said. "It's not helpful." "Give it to me," Mies Ledger said, with a voice that had the patience of steel filings. He resisted like a child clinging to a forbidden candy wrapper. The file had a label rubbed thin. The label read, "The Big Week That Smiled." There was a room for files like that in my head now. It was a museum for misfits, rain that falls only on sad parades, a stray dog who once learned to whistle, a calendar page that refused to blink. We had all, in our secret hours, kept a small rebellion pinned under a desk. Owen's was a precise, crinkled paper with a corner chewed by a pen. He had hidden it because when he thought about erasing it, the image of a child laughing in a sudden sunlight made him dizzy with longing. "It saved somebody," he said, as if that would explain why a grown man kept a piece of paperwork like a talisman. It wasn't official, it was the kind of mistake that did no harm. Mies Ledger's mouth tightened and softened in a rhythm I recognized, the negotiation of the conscious and the sentimental. She didn't take the file then. Instead, she folded her hands and told us a story about a regulation she'd bent once when the weather festival of a small town faced obliteration by a bureaucratic comma. The kind of story that smelled of ozone and heroism, the kind that makes you understand why rules exist and why, sometimes, they must be lopped for compassion. "We are custodians," she said. "We keep things that cannot keep themselves. But we are also judges and sometimes executioners. We must decide which continuities someone's life needs, and which are crufts. There is no cosmic stamp that tells you which is which." It was the kind of thing that in another life would have been printed on a poster. In the bureau it is printed in the tiny, practical font of marginalia and tucked into a sleeve. We all listened. Registrar Amy shuffled her requisitions and placed a stamp face down, as if to conjure courage. "If you let this go, Owen," she said, "if you hand it over without conditions, what will you lose?" "Sleep," he said, as if that were the currency of all bravery. I wished for invisibility. I wished also to be brave enough to make a small, selfless decision. It's simple in theory: hand over the file, fix the sequence, save the world from lobster mayors and swapped Tuesdays. It's harder when the file is, in real terms, someone's private weather, someone's refusal to be graded into neat columns. This is when Mies Ledger turned to me and did something I hadn't expected. She taught me a trick. She called it procedural subterfuge, which, to me, sounded like a euphemism and a charm. She sat me down at a battered table and produced a tray of stamps and envelopes and a lamp that flickered with authority. The lamp made everything look like evidence. Shadows were only the parts of things we refused to see. Her hands moved quickly. She showed me how to write what she called a double-hinged memo that reads as two memos at once depending on where you tilt it. A semantic hinge that allows a signature to apply and also to withhold. "It's not lying," she said. "It's not cruelty. It's a way to say yes and no at the same time while preserving the paperwork's dignity." Her voice was honey sealed in ice. She taught me to fold sentences so that a clause could perform like a door, open for one signature, closed for another. She inked an example into my hand as if imprinting a tattoo of compromise. "The bureau is a machine of translation," she said. "Sometimes you must translate mercy into ink and back again." I stamped a sample form until my fingers shone with residue. I felt like an apprentice to an old, useful god. That practice mattered because the slip didn't like neat language. The slip listened to certainty and then made it sound foolish, while Mies Ledger tutored me. Registrar Amy took pleasure in the small, exact ritual of processing a tardy requisition. She leaned over a steam of papers and pressed a seal into a form like a jeweler setting a stone. The sound was a discreet bell. In that moment the world contracted. Everything left me except the bell and the flattening of ink. Some stamps, she told me, are pacifiers. I wanted to believe her. When she slid the requisition across, it was as if we had all been given a breath. The request was accepted into the fold of officialness. It did not cure the world of its misalignments, but it reminded me that certain rituals did hold weight. There was a romance gossip humming in the stacks, as quiet as a moth. Registrar Amy and I had been small satellites orbiting each other, coffee traded for the favor of a stamp, shy smiles over ink-spattered counters. The misplaced week had put our orbit into danger. The week could be misplaced in such a way that whatever small, tender conversation would slide into the wrong slot of memory and never be stitched back. It was ludicrous and mortal all at once. "Do we keep it?" she asked me once, fingers steady as a clerk's, voice trembling like a page caught in a draft. If keeping it means someone else loses a laughter. I didn't have a neat answer. I had a heart that wanted to conserve warmth. I had a brain that was newly, painfully aware of the ethical ledger. I had also, embarrassingly, a desire for someone to notice my exact handwriting. We needed leverage. Mr. Pockets emerged with his pockets full of weather. He is a man who, rumor holds, has a pocket for every orphaned thing in the city. He opened one pocket and from it exhaled the faint smell of metal and memory. He presented us with an object wrapped in a receipt, a small tin that when shaken sounded like rain in an old cathedral. "This could bait the slip," he said. "It likes things that were meant to be and then weren't. It likes a little nostalgia in a paper costume." Dot agreed to be our courier for the moment, drawn by the offer of pastry and a promise that there would be marginalia to nibble. Dot is what you get when someone inks a joke too late at night, impish and fond of ellipses. It made our plan feel ridiculous and sacred at once. We assembled our arguments such as they were. Mies Ledger argued for preservation with boundaries. Registrar Amy argued for human judgment and the sanctity of careful seals. Owen argued with a softness that made him suddenly small, for the right to keep a tender error. I argued for atonement, somewhere in the middle, a compromise word into being, half legalese, half lullaby. "We will not archive this into oblivion, Mies," Ledger said, "not without a preservation clause. We will file a careful exemption and put a curator on it. We will catalogue the error with gratitude. And if it creates more slips," I asked, because I am, at my best, alarmist. "Then we learn to live with some blunders," she said. "Some errors are not pests. They are margins where people can hide nice things." The floor of the amendment stacks rattled like a throat when you laugh too hard. I had the sense that the building approved with a small, bureaucratic cough. The alliance was not so much forged as it was forged with the constant hammering of practical details, who signs as witness, how long the exemption lasts, whether the curator must file an annual apology. These are the things that make a revolution manageable. But Owen's hoarded file did more than complicate our chain of signatures. It humanized the danger. He was not a novelist of entropy. He was someone who could let go. His eyes betrayed nights spent defending the trivial against the tidy. When he finally agreed to hand the file to us, he did so with the daunting grace of someone signing a surrender so that something humane might survive. He asked for conditions that the file be kept in a drawer marked maybe, and that no automation ever lay its metal hand on it. Mies. Ledger quirked a corner of her mouth. She punched in a clause and wrote it in the margin in a tiny, precise hand, may be consulted by custodians of human judgment only. "That's a good clause," she said, then added with bureaucratic kindness, "You repair it when you can, Owen." He promised to try. The promise felt like stapling a small hope into place. By the time we left for lunch, something had shifted. The misfiles trail pointed, at last, toward the basement of amendments. We had the map and Mr. Pocket's tin and Dot's enthusiasm. We had Registrar Amy's official seal and Mies, Ledger's slow, indestructible cunning. We had Owen's file, which we had promised to protect, and which in its crinkled way taught me more about mercy than any manual on corrective forms ever could. But the week still hummed in the hallways like an unfinished song. The romance between Amy and me did not vanish. Instead, it hovered like a delicate marginal note, its fate now tied to the timeliness of a stamp and the temperament of the slip. I found myself thinking about fingerprints left on folders, about how human things are like stamps. You press them down and some ink stays behind. Don't get cute, mens. Ledger told me as we descended, and her voice was the only safety harness I needed. Remember, signatures matter and hearts matter. Both can be preserved if we act like careful archivists and not like heroic vandals. I promised her I would. I promised solemnly, like someone pledging to return a book to the library. As we stepped into the stairwell, the light inverted itself into the color of low toner and distant thunder. The basement of amendments breathed on us like an old thing waking and said, without speaking, that the slip would be waiting somewhere between a redaction and a stamp. We had made our alliances, negotiated our clauses, and stolen a tin of rain. We had decided to protect one tender misfile at the cost of complicating a clear restoration. That choice felt, in the marrow of the thing, like an ethical stapling, small and very particular. At the bottom of the stairs, the air got cold enough to make my glass lenses fog, and Dot, which had been quiet for most of the afternoon, left a neat string of ellipses on the handrail as if to spell out our imminent irony. I touched the marginalia and felt wet ink. The paper trail had led us true, and for once I believed that following a line of scrawled doubt might teach me more about stamps than any textbook. We were ready for the basement, and the basement, as if it had an ear, was ready for us. But readiness in the bureau is a relative notion. You can bring every form and still be surprised by the way a thing looks when it is finally confronted like a smug grin frozen mid-sneeze. I did not know then whether the compromise we had hammered into being would mollify the slip or merely amuse it. I only knew that we had chosen people over perfect ledger lines, and that in the quiet before the next mischief the world felt, strangely, like a book laid open where someone had tucked a pressed flower inside. It is an unscientific optimism, literature's kind of courage, believing that some misfiles are gifts. We walked into the basement corridor, signatures prepped and clauses folded like little safe-keeping envelopes. Somewhere in the dark a redaction machine coughed, and I felt the slip stir as if to say hello. I tightened my blazer, tried not to hum the Beerus tea jingle aloud, and stepped forward, because the thing I had most to prove was not that I could fix a catastrophe, but that I could, on occasion, refuse a sterile order for the sake of a person I had not yet finished learning to be. We reached the heavy door stamped with a date that hadn't existed last Tuesday. It was time to open it, and it was time for me to decide which edges of the world I would staple back together and which I would leave with a grateful margin. The key in Mies Ledger's hand felt like a promise. The map in Harman Vance's pocket hummed faintly. Owen tucked his fist into his coat and drew up a breath long enough to be a small apology. Registrar Amy held out the requisition like a white flag scribbled in official blue. Dot twitched its coffee-stained halo, and Pocket smiled as if he had expected everything all along. On 3, Mies Ledger said, and the word 3 sounded like a legal tender. We counted. The door did not open politely. It sighed. We stepped through.